On a crisp winter morning, the hum of Aerosky Airlines Flight 417 was broken by a voice sharp enough to slice steel. "This isn't the welfare line, ma'am. First class is for paying customers." Gasps rippled through the cabin as all eyes turned to a poised black woman in seat 2A. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. Her calm gaze lingered on the flight attendant like a surgeon studying a patient before a fatal incision. 10 minutes before takeoff, the humiliation was public. The cameras were rolling. Yet Dr. Naomi Ellington's silence was the most dangerous weapon on the plane. The cabin of Aerosky Flight 417 held its breath the way a theater hushes before curtains lift. Amber light warmed the headrests. Glassware chimed. Winter sun stretched like silk along row 2. In seat 2A, Dr. Naomi Ellington slid her tablet into airplane mode and closed the leather case with a small, decisive click. Shadows moved. A voice, smooth as chrome and cold as it, leaned over the aisle and sliced the air. "This isn't the welfare line, ma'am. First class is for paying customers." Every head pivoted toward the remark as if pulled by wire. Incomparably calm. Heather Collins smiled the way some people snap a cufflink. Precise, practiced, meant to show ownership. Her uniform fit like armor. The boarding pass in Naomi's hand became, under Heather's fingers, a prop for punishment. She snatched it, scrutinized it like contraband, and slapped the paper back against Naomi's chest with force, a dry thud that traveled farther than sound. Somewhere, a fork chimed inside a glass. Naomi did not flinch. She smoothed the crease with her thumb and let stillness explain itself, which it rarely does. Someone inhaled to laugh and then thought better. She remained composed. The refusal to perform outrage fascinated the cabin. In 1C, a man raised his phone. In 1D, Margaret Hill whispered a verdict dressed as concern. Along the aisle, strangers exchanged the small smiles of people guarding gates. Naomi said only, evenly, that she was seated correctly. A pause opened, and Heather filled it with theater. She lifted her own phone, tilting the lens to flatter her and diminish the woman beside her. "Quick update from the front," she cooed to an audience of strangers. "Some folks think any seat is their seat." Numbers on her screen jumped like applause. The interphone clicked. Heather requested security as if ordering more ice. Performative compassion wrapped the cabin like bubble wrap. Applause arrived as complicity. Nods, smirks. The chuckle meant to sting without ownership. Naomi unlatched her tray, set the boarding pass on the veneer, and unlocked her phone. A grid of muted icons bloomed. For a second, a discreet badge flashed at the corner of an app. Senate. Secure. Then vanished beneath her thumb. She did not look at Heather. She regarded the window instead, where a sliver of tarmac glared white, and her reflection sat inside it like a second passenger refusing to move. A young woman in 3B, Sophia Ramirez, watched the tiny moment and felt her posture change, though she could not have explained why. In 4C, Michael Turner rose halfway before caution and history pushed him back down. The moment stretched. Heather narrated without profanity, which made the cruelty feel corporate. She announced an imminent seat reassignment, offered passengers her tired professionalism like a mint, and noted how long delays cost everybody. The camera in 1C zoomed, catching Naomi's watch, her quiet jacket, the order she kept around herself. Evidence to be misread by people searching for permission to doubt. Security arrived as 2 men engineered to fill narrow spaces. Their questions were procedural. Their posture said the outcome was already filed. The lead officer glanced at Heather, then Naomi, and recommended compliance in a tone that translated as inevitability. Naomi offered the boarding pass again, not like surrender, but like presenting a page she had already read to the end. The elderly woman in 1D murmured something about scams. A cluster of passengers pretended to stretch while filming. The plane became a courtroom without a bench, and the aisle turned into a record of who sat where when fairness stopped being convenient. Brian Hughes, the gate manager, stepped in with a tablet and an air of crisp emergency. He spoke of sophisticated forgeries, recent incidents, and a manual hold the system had raised, though his thumbprint had placed it there moments earlier. He proposed deplaning for extended verification to protect operations. Integrity, in his mouth, sounded like convenience wearing a tie. Naomi texted 3 messages, each shorter than a breath, then turned the phone face down as if closing a piano lid. Her shoulders were still, her breathing even. The winter light advanced 1 measured inch along the aisle carpet. The cabin learned the sport of taking sides. Some faces warmed to Heather's confidence out of habit. Others cooled, sensing something off-key in the choreography. Margaret stared at Naomi's bag like it had committed a crime. A man in 1C narrated into his stream, building an audience around a story he didn't own. Sophia inhaled, found her voice. She said to nobody and everybody that she had seen the ticket, and it said 2A. The sentence sounded small, but it made circles through the room. A pebble disturbing a ceremonial surface that had expected to remain untroubled. Time flowered and folded. The departure window tightened. Heather smiled for viewers, Brian for metrics. The officer shifted weight from conscience to policy. Naomi aligned the boarding pass with the seam of the tray table, patient as a metronome. She considered the cost of rage and paid with silence instead. Outside, a ribbon of winter light fell across the wing. Inside, the temperature changed by half a degree. When truth approaches. Naomi unlatched a slim case and set a single black card face down beside the pass, its beveled edge catching light like a contained spark. The moment lengthened, quietly. She offered no speech, only courtesy sharpened to a point. She asked again for the captain, not as threat, not as plea, simply as the correct location for responsibility. The lead officer paused, hearing the difference between volume and authority. He radioed. Footsteps approached, parting the aisle. Captain Douglas Reed appeared with 30 years in his eyes and stripes that had seen worse storms. He asked to see the ticket and ID and actually read them. The ion in the air shifted. Procedure, however, is a net scary enough to trap its own fishermen. He said he needed to verify. Naomi nodded. She knew patience is a kind of engine. The room continued pretending to be a city. Phones hovered like streetlights. Somewhere near the galley, someone laughed and then regretted it. Brian rehearsed phrases about risk and compliance. Heather curled her live stream away from the scene, angling for sympathy. Naomi refused the audition. She centered the card, the pass, her breath. She looked at the captain, at the window, where winter lay bright and indifferent. The story did not bend to her voice because it did not need to. It would bend to gravity, and gravity was already shifting. Brian Hughes appeared in the aisle with the stiff gait of someone rehearsing authority. His uniform was pressed too sharply. His tablet was held like a shield. "We've had a string of sophisticated forgeries this quarter," he announced to the air, though his eyes stayed on Naomi Ellington. The words were dressed as procedure, but the tone was designed to plant suspicion. He tapped his screen, and the boarding pass information Naomi had already presented flickered into a manual review status, an act he had initiated seconds before walking down the aisle. Heather Collins stood just behind him, her phone angled discreetly, still live to a growing audience. She threw in a sympathetic nod for Brian's benefit, a pantomime of teamwork. "Better safe than sorry," she told the passengers, as if protecting them from a con artist. Michael Turner in 4C leaned forward, his eyes catching the glint of Naomi's platinum Amex Centurion card peeking from her leather wallet. Sophia Ramirez in 3B noticed the same detail, and the small QR code on the boarding pass, one she knew was Aerosky's current encrypted format. Both recognized what they were seeing, proof of legitimacy. But recognition is not the same as intervention. Brian's fingers danced over his tablet. "Pending," the system flashed in bold orange letters. He didn't explain that pending meant nothing more than his own choice to lock the record. To the untrained eye, it looked like the system itself was skeptical. Naomi sat back, letting the small scene play out. She didn't fight the moment. She didn't fill it with justifications. Her hand moved to her phone again, and she typed 3 short entries. Asked, delay, stand by for update. Legal, record interactions, hold response. Chair, in contact shortly. The screen locked with a chime, and she placed it face down on the tray table beside the boarding pass. It was an act of trust in her own process, not in the people surrounding her. Heather glanced at Brian with a conspirator's grin, then stepped toward the interphone again. Let's get another officer up here, she said. We might need to escort her to the gate for verification. The line between safety and spectacle was long gone. This was performance now. A few rows back, murmurs spread. These scammers get more creative every year, someone whispered. Another voice countered softly, I don't think she's lying. The division was visible in the tilt of heads, in who kept filming and who put their phones down. Brian crouched slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound confidential but loud enough for nearby rows to catch. Ma'am, if you cooperate, we can have you rebooked within a couple of hours, but if you resist, you might miss your connection entirely. Naomi turned her gaze on him, steady, unblinking. I'm not resisting, she said evenly. I'm occupying the seat I paid for. The lack of heat in her voice made the words heavier, not lighter. Heather reappeared, a security officer now shadowing her. The officer's face was neutral, but his body language tilted toward readiness. Can we see the original method of payment? Heather asked, knowing full well that was neither standard nor required. Michael's jaw tightened. He'd been in this seat before, not literally, but in situations where legitimacy had to be proven twice, 3 times, because of skin or accent. He glanced at Sophia, who was still watching Naomi's composure like it was a masterclass. Naomi reached for her bag, withdrew the Amex, and set it neatly beside the boarding pass. Here is the payment method, she said. The Centurion's brushed metal gleamed in the cabin light. Brian's eyes flickered to it, then away, like a man avoiding a mirror. Sophia caught sight of the small details others missed. The embossed expiration date, the micro-engraved serial that only the bank could produce. This was no forgery, but she bit her lip, the weight of a dozen unspoken memories holding her back. Brian's tablet pinged. He had received a system prompt, one he had triggered, to escalate to ground verification. He turned the screen so Heather could see. Pending, see? He said, playing the role of impartial messenger. Heather's lips curved. Looks like we'll need you to step off, ma'am. Naomi didn't move. She glanced once at the phone, still face down, still exactly where she'd placed it after those 3 messages. She exhaled slowly, as if sinking breath with patience. In the rear of the cabin, Jacob Miller in 1C adjusted his live stream angle, capturing Naomi's stillness framed by the growing bustle. This is getting interesting, he muttered for his viewers. The comment feed raced, some calling for her removal, others urging the crew to back off. Brian straightened, folding his tablet into the crook of his arm. I'll give you a moment to collect your belongings, he said, his tone almost polite. Naomi's eyes tracked him as he stepped away. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached for the boarding pass and the Centurion card, aligning them perfectly on the tray table once more. Her fingers tapped the phone's side button twice. No screen lit, no sound emerged, but somewhere in the digital background, signals moved. Heather lingered by the curtain to the galley, whispering into her phone. Michael leaned back, murmuring something under his breath that Sophia couldn't quite catch. The security officer shifted from one foot to the other, clearly uncertain. Procedure was on his side, perception was not. The passenger in 5A called out, "What's the holdup?" And the question seemed to legitimize Brian's narrative. Delay equals guilt. Naomi's gaze returned to the window. Beyond the glass, a fuel truck trundled past, oblivious to the human theater inside the cabin. She watched it as if it mattered more than the people attempting to displace her. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I heard the request," Naomi interrupted, not unkindly. And I will remain in the seat I purchased until a proper review is conducted by the appropriate authority. It wasn't defiance in her tone. It was fact. The kind that doesn't bend under pressure, only under truth. Somewhere deep in the belly of the airport, a secure line buzzed. One of 3 messages beginning its journey to change the trajectory of this flight. The tension inside Aerosky Flight 417 was no longer subtle. It was a living thing, breathing in sync with the hum of the cabin. Jacob Miller in 1C had his phone tilted just enough to catch Naomi Ellington's profile and the tight choreography of crew movements around her. The caption on his stream read simply, "Drama in first class," but the hashtag pinned beneath it, #first-class fraud, had already begun to ignite outside the aircraft. Comments poured in. "She's busted. Can't believe people still try this. Make her show the receipt." The live chat scrolled so fast, Jacob couldn't read half of it. The small charged space of first class was now tethered to thousands of strangers' judgments, all fed by a stream that never panned to Heather or Brian. Margaret Hill in 1D, emboldened by the chorus from Jacob's audience, leaned toward her husband and said in a voice meant to be overheard, "They always find some excuse. I've seen it before." Her words fell like pebbles into a pond already rippling with suspicion. A passenger in 5A muttered agreement. Another in 2C frowned but kept silent. The atmosphere thickened. Heather, still working her own live feed in brief, secretive bursts, adjusted her smile for an invisible audience. Brian stood a few feet back, his arms folded, surveying the scene like a foreman satisfied with the progress of construction. Then, without warning, a new video hit the trending tab on a local social media channel. It was a clip, 30 seconds long, showing Naomi boarding the aircraft, then standing briefly near the curtain between business and first class. The angle was tight, the audio distorted, but the implication was clear. She'd slipped into 2A without authorization. No one in the cabin knew it yet, but the clip was a fabrication, spliced from security footage and a passenger's unrelated phone video. Heather's phone buzzed. She glanced down and smirked. "Looks like people are catching on," she murmured to Brian. A few rows away, a passenger's device pinged with a notification, and within minutes the clip had been passed down the aisle, each replay cementing the idea that Naomi was exactly what Heather had painted her to be. Sophia Ramirez, still seated in 3B, caught a glimpse of the video on the screen in 4A. She recognized the grainy boarding shot and knew it didn't match the timeline. She'd been right behind Naomi at the gate, watching her scan her ticket without incident. But speaking up now felt like stepping into a rip current. Michael Turner in 4C saw the same clip. His jaw clenched. He knew editing when he saw it, but his voice stuck in the same place it had the last time he'd been misjudged in public. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and stared at the floor. Naomi, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the spreading lie. Her eyes remained on the boarding pass and Centurion card neatly aligned on her tray table. The phone still lay face down beside them, silent but not idle. She waited until the murmurs reached a certain pitch, then lifted her gaze to Brian. "I'd like to speak to the captain," she said, her voice even, pitched to carry. Brian's eyebrows rose. "The captain has delegated all passenger seating issues to me. I have full authority to handle this matter." "Nonetheless," Naomi replied, "I will speak with him directly." Heather stepped in. "Ma'am, the captain is preparing for departure. He can't be pulled away for every seating dispute." "This isn't a dispute," Naomi said. "It's a request for the appropriate chain of command." Brian's lips pressed into a line. "The appropriate chain of command begins and ends with me in this case. You'll need to comply." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Noted," she said simply, and leaned back in her seat, hands resting lightly on the armrests. The refusal to argue disarmed him more than any raised voice could have. Still, he turned to the security officer stationed nearby. "We may have to escort her off. Stand by." In the corner of her vision, Naomi caught movement. Jacob angling his camera to include the officer's looming frame in the shot. The image would feed a narrative. Uncooperative passenger. Reluctant but necessary removal. The lie was gathering gravity now. The hashtag #First-Class Fraud climbed another rung on the trending chart. Somewhere in the web of connected feeds, the doctored clip played on repeat, its flaws overlooked by those too eager to believe. Sophia bit her lip harder. The taste of copper filled her mouth. Michael's hands tightened into fists, then loosened, then tightened again. Margaret sat back, satisfied. Her earlier whisper now validated in her mind. Heather adjusted her scarf, a small performance for whoever might be watching later. Brian checked his watch, feigning the pressure of the departure clock. The officer shifted again, clearly ready to move at a nod. Naomi's phone buzzed once, faint enough to be missed unless you were watching her closely. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she let her eyes travel to the window, tracing the shape of another aircraft taxiing in the distance. Her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders did, an almost imperceptible preparation. The cabin waited, some for drama, some for justice, others simply for the flight to resume. But the balance was off now. The court of public opinion had tilted. Brian could feel it, and knew it favored him. He stepped forward again. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate." Naomi looked up at him with calm that bordered on unnerving. "By all means," she said. "Escalate." The words hung in the air, weightless and heavy all at once. The murmur of passengers was an unsteady tide, ebbing when silence settled, surging again with each movement from the crew. Near the cockpit, Captain Douglas Reed caught fragments of the situation over the interphone. Passenger refusal, pending verification, possible removal. His instinct was to step into the cabin, to see for himself. 30 years in the air had taught him that sometimes the quickest way to resolve a conflict was to meet eyes and measure character. He had just taken a step toward the curtain when Brian Hughes's voice came through the channel, low but firm. "I've got this, Captain. Let me complete the verification before you get involved." It was couched as deference, but the subtext was control. Keep the chain of command tight. Keep the narrative in his hands. Reed hesitated, the flight clock ticking in the back of his mind. Procedures mattered, but so did optics, and he knew how quickly stories could warp when told secondhand. In 2A, Naomi Ellington hadn't moved. Her boarding pass and Centurion card still lay perfectly aligned on the tray table, her phone beside them. But now she reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a slim, matte black business card holder. The hinge clicked softly as she opened it, and from within she drew a single black card, thick as a coin and edged with beveled steel. Without a word, she placed the card face down on the tray, directly beside the boarding pass. To most, it was just another piece of stationery, but the angle caught the overhead light, and a faint shimmer rippled over its surface. Microscopic laser etching that shifted with each degree of movement. From her seat in 3B, Sophia Ramirez caught it. Her breath hitched. She'd worked in aerospace procurement for a regional carrier before joining her current firm, and she knew what she was seeing. The microseal used only on high-level executive identification within the aviation industry. You couldn't fake it. Not without access to the same secure fabrication channels that issued official credentials to C-suite executives and senior government liaisons. Her eyes darted to Naomi's face, then back to the card. The realization settled like a stone in her chest. This woman wasn't just a wealthy passenger. She was someone embedded at the heart of the industry itself. But the rest of the cabin didn't notice, or didn't care. The viral clip still danced through devices. The hashtag still climbed, and Brian still commanded the stage. He stepped closer to Naomi, tapping his tablet. "We'll need you to step off now, ma'am. Verification has to be done on the ground. Standard protocol." Heather hovered at his shoulder. The corners of her mouth curved just enough to convey satisfaction. "Once we clear this up, you can take the next flight," she added, her voice dripping with faux reassurance. The security officer shifted forward, his shadow falling over Naomi's row. Passengers leaned in. phones raised like court reporters ready to record the verdict. Naomi lifted her gaze to Brian, then to the officer. Her voice was calm, deliberate. You might want to call the right person before you take another step. Brian blinked, momentarily thrown by the phrasing. The right person? Yes, she said, her fingers resting lightly on the black card. The one who actually has the authority to decide how this plays out. It wasn't a threat, but something in her tone carried weight, like a line of code about to execute. The officer hesitated, glancing at Brian for direction. Security handles removals, Brian said quickly. That's our authority here. He gestured for the officer to proceed. From the galley, a flight attendant peeked out, eyes flicking between the standoff and the cockpit door. The tension in the air had its own gravity now, pulling everyone toward the same center point. The woman in 2A, still seated, still unshaken. Sophia leaned forward, her voice low enough to avoid carrying beyond Michael in 4C. That's not just any card, she murmured. She's someone. Michael followed her gaze, catching the faint glint of the micro seal. His frown deepened. Naomi's hand stayed on the card, unmoving. One call, she said softly, almost to herself. That's all it takes. The phrase was unremarkable to those who didn't know the subtext, but to Sophia, it was a loaded trigger. In the aviation world, a single well-placed call could ground fleets, reroute crews, or end contracts overnight. Brian misread the moment as compliance cloaked in poetry. Then let's make that call on the ground, he said. Right now, you need to come with us. Her gaze didn't waver. If you were wise, Mr. Hughes, you'd let the captain hear me before you escalate this further. At that, Heather rolled her eyes. She's stalling. This is classic behavior. Make it a bigger deal so you can't get kicked off without an audience. Phones in the nearest rows tilted closer, microphones straining for every syllable. Jacob's stream counter ticked upward again. Somewhere down the cabin, a passenger muttered about delays in connections, feeding the pressure like dry leaves to a flame. Captain Reed's voice crackled through the interphone again. Status, Brian? Brian pressed the transmit button. Still unresolved. Moving to remove the passenger now. Reed's pause was noticeable. Copy. Keep me posted. The officer took a half step forward, his hand brushing the headrest in front of Naomi's seat. It was the smallest advance, but it shifted the air. Naomi's right hand slid off the card and onto her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen without pressing. You have one last opportunity to make the correct choice, she said quietly. It was not said in anger. It was not said in haste. But it made the officer pause again, his instincts warring with his orders. Brian exhaled sharply. Ma'am, we're done here. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. No, she said. You are. And in that instant, though no one else in the cabin could see it, her phone screen lit with a secure dial pad, 3 numbers away from altering the balance of authority on Flight 417 forever. The aisle parted as Captain Douglas Reed finally stepped through the curtain, the muted rustle of his pressed uniform marking his arrival. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, and when they landed on Naomi Ellington, something shifted. A flicker of recognition that he quickly buried beneath a professional mask. Hold on, Reed said, his voice steady but carrying authority that made both the security officer and Brian pause mid-motion. Nobody touches the passenger until I understand exactly what's going on. Brian straightened, masking his irritation. Captain, we're in the middle of a verification process. The system flagged her ticket. We were just about to escort her for further checks. Reed's gaze moved from Brian to Naomi. May I see your boarding pass and identification, ma'am? Naomi handed them over without hesitation. Reed studied them, noting the details. The flawless match between name, ID, and boarding pass. His thumb brushed the raised ink on the ticket, a texture he knew could not be replicated by the knockoff printer scammers used. For a moment, it seemed like the tide might turn. Reed's eyes narrowed, his jaw set. He looked like a man ready to overrule the noise and restore order. The passengers leaned in, sensing a shift toward resolution. But then, protocol wrapped itself around him like a chain. "These appear legitimate," he said slowly. "But given the sensitivity of the situation, I'll need to verify through our legal and leasing channels before making a final determination." The words landed like a weight dropped into water. The ripple of hope that had begun to move through the cabin faltered, broke apart. Naomi's expression didn't change. "Very well, Captain," she said evenly. "Perhaps this will expedite your process." From her bag, she withdrew a sleek tablet and tapped the screen. A PDF document filled it. High resolution, watermarked, and unmistakable to anyone in aviation. She rotated the device for Reed to see. "This," she said, "is the active lease agreement between Aerosky Airlines and Carter Ellington Aviation for aircraft tail number N867CE, the very aircraft we are sitting in now." Gasps rippled through the closest rows. Michael Turner leaned forward, eyes darting from the document to Reed. Sophia caught the tail number at the top and recognized it instantly. She'd seen it in trade publications when Carter Ellington's acquisitions were covered. Reed took the tablet, scanning the header, the contract clauses, the signatures, one of which bore Naomi's own name as signatory. He exhaled slowly. "It's compelling," he admitted. "But as captain, I have to follow company protocol. All contractual matters need to be confirmed through legal before I can act on them." The crowd's mood shifted again, doubt seeping back in where confidence had briefly bloomed. Some passengers murmured that documents could be forged. Others whispered that this seemed like an awfully elaborate lie for a seat upgrade. Heather, standing off to the side, caught Reed's hesitation and saw her opening. She lowered her phone just enough to type a quick message. "Activate PR, internal channel, push boarding dispute narrative to media partners." The send button glowed briefly before the message vanished into the stream of corporate chatter. In her live stream, Heather switched to a measured tone, explaining to her viewers that verification is still pending and hinting that certain individuals sometimes fabricate documents to intimidate crew. She never said Naomi's name, but the insinuation was baked into every word. Naomi caught the flicker of Heather's thumbs and the faint satisfaction in her eyes afterward. She knew exactly what had been set in motion. Still, she chose silence, allowing Reed to wrestle with his bind between the evidence in his hand and the constraints of company rules. Reed handed back the tablet. "I'll start the verification process immediately," he said, stepping toward the galley phone. "In the meantime, no further action is to be taken without my say-so." It wasn't victory, but it was a stall, enough to keep Naomi in her seat for the moment. The security officer relaxed his stance slightly, though his eyes stayed on her. Jacob Miller in 1C caught it all on his stream, narrating with the tone of a man who couldn't decide which side he was on. "Captain's involved now," he told his audience. "She's got some kind of contract for the plane, but they're saying it still needs verifying. This could go either way." In 3B, Sophia felt the knot in her chest tighten. She knew that verification would take time, a resource Naomi might not have if the PR narrative outside the plane was already being shaped against her. Heather leaned close to Brian, her voice a low thread. "By the time he verifies, this will already be a PR issue. We'll be the ones on the right side of it." Brian's lips twitched in agreement, his eyes following Reed as the captain disappeared toward the cockpit phone. Naomi picked up her boarding pass, sliding it carefully back into her wallet alongside the Centurion card. Her fingers brushed the black, micro-etched card she had placed on the tray earlier. It was still there, still waiting, a quiet promise of leverage yet to be used. The cabin buzzed with speculation. To some, the reveal of the lease contract was proof enough. To others, it was just another layer in a con. And in the narrow space between those two perceptions, Heather and Brian worked to tip the balance. Outside, winter lights slanted across the tarmac, indifferent to the human theater inside. Inside, time stretched thin, each minute an opportunity for the scales to tip in one direction or the other. Naomi remained still, watching the current swirl around her. She had made one reveal, but not the one that would end this. Not yet. The pause Reed had forced into the process was barely 2 minutes old when the first wave hit. On social media, the hashtag #ArrowSkyBias began to take root, seeded by a handful of passengers who had posted snippets of the confrontation without context. The clips were shaky, sometimes muffled, but the common thread was clear. A poised black woman refusing to leave a first-class seat while crew members attempted to do their jobs. Then came the second strike, sharper and far more dangerous. A leaked report from an anonymous account claiming insider knowledge. It described Naomi Ellington as a serial upgrade scammer, known for exploiting loopholes to claim premium seats she hadn't paid for. The language was careful, couched in legal gray, but the smear was obvious. Within minutes, the rumor was grafted onto every conversation about the incident, solidifying the perception for those already inclined to believe it. In 1C, Jacob Miller's stream numbers spiked again. His comment feed split into warring camps, those citing the leak as proof, and those demanding to know why Aerosky was trending alongside words like bias and racial profiling. Heather checked her phone between smiles to passengers, her eyes narrowing as she read the growing thread of supportive replies to the scammer narrative. She didn't post it herself. That was the beauty of corporate PR damage control. You never had to leave fingerprints when others would do the work for you. Across the aisle, Naomi's phone vibrated twice, the silent pattern she'd set for priority alerts. She unlocked it, her expression unchanged, and opened a secure dashboard. The screen filled with a clean, data-rich interface. At the top, the tail number N867CE, the aircraft they were sitting in, flanked by contract metadata and operational status. Below it, a PDF icon pulsed gently. She tapped it, and the lease agreement she'd shown Reed earlier appeared again, this time with an annotated overlay. Payment schedules, aircraft specifications, and, highlighted in gold, Section 47, Anti-Discrimination and Hostile Environment Provisions. Her index finger traced the clause as if committing it to memory. Any lessee found to engage in discriminatory practices against protected classes while operating leased aircraft may face immediate contract review and potential termination. The numbers didn't just match, they were perfect. Payment records aligned down to the cent. The tail number in the clause matched the metal body surrounding them. The authority implicit in those words was surgical, precise enough to cut through the entire chain of command if deployed. Sofia Ramirez caught a glimpse of the glowing screen from her seat and felt a chill. This wasn't a bluff. Naomi wasn't just a passenger with means. She was a contractual stakeholder with the ability to shake the very foundations of the airline's operations. But before Naomi could press the advantage, Brian Hughes stepped back into her row, his expression a portrait of feigned regret. "Ma'am," he began, "in light of the conflicting information and the time-sensitive nature of our departure slot, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane so we can conduct verification on the ground." It was delivered like a favor, but Naomi heard the tactic underneath. By moving her off the aircraft, Brian would remove her from the eyes and ears of the passengers, dissolve the protective witness of a full cabin, and place her in the far murkier domain of back-office procedures, where narratives could be rewritten in minutes. Michael Turner in 4C straightened. "Captain Reed said no action without his say-so," he reminded, his voice carrying just enough to draw a few glances. Brian smiled thinly. "The captain trusts my judgment on passenger service matters, and right now the judgment is clear. We're at risk of losing our slot." Jacob's camera shifted to capture Naomi's reaction, his audience practically vibrating with anticipation. Heather lingered in the background, her expression carefully neutral for anyone recording, though her eyes shone with something closer to victory. Naomi closed the dashboard on her phone and placed it deliberately on the tray table, face down once more. "The correct verification can happen here," she said. "With the captain present, there is no operational need to remove me." Brian's smile didn't falter. "There's also no operational benefit to continuing this standoff on the aircraft." He turned slightly toward the security officer. Let's move her, please. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit curtain. Procedure told him to defer to the highest-ranking crew member available. Pressure told him to clear the delay. Outside, the faint whine of taxiing aircraft underscored the ticking clock. Inside, the pressure condensed into a single moment. Naomi seated, composed, with an entire cabin watching the balance of power teeter. Sophia gripped the armrests, her mind racing through possible outcomes. Michael's gaze locked on Naomi, willing her to hold her ground. Jacob's viewers spammed the chat with commands. Refuse! Call your lawyer! Film everything! Naomi looked up at Brian, her voice calm enough to cut through the hum. If you force me off this plane without the captain's direct order, you will be in violation of both your company's operating manual and the federal provisions outlined in this lease agreement. Brian's jaw tightened. That's for legal to decide. And they will, Naomi replied. But so will the board of directors, if I decide this breach merits it. The words were quiet, almost conversational, but the effect was a subtle shift in the room's air pressure. Those who had doubted began to glance between her and Brian with new calculation. Still, Brian pushed. Officer! The curtain to the cockpit stirred. Reed's voice came over the PA, measured and calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a short delay as we complete some final verifications. Thank you for your patience. Naomi's eyes didn't leave Brian's. That was the right person, she said softly. The curtain parted, and Captain Reed emerged once more, his stride firmer than before. His face was pale but resolute, the expression of a man who had just received confirmation that every assumption made about this situation was dangerously wrong. He stopped at 2A, looking directly at Naomi Ellington. Dr. Ellington, he said with a new weight in his voice, I apologize for the delay. There's been a significant misunderstanding. Gasps rose from a few nearby passengers, the first sign that the narrative was shifting. Brian Hughes took an involuntary half-step back, his tablet lowering to his side. Heather Collins, still standing just behind him, masked her confusion with a stiff smile. Naomi inclined her head politely, her tone even. Perhaps we can clarify things for everyone, Captain. She reached for her bag, withdrew the black, micro-etched card, and this time flipped it face up on the tray table. The logo glinted, a stylized wing flanked by laurel leaves, the name beneath it clean and precise. Carter Ellington Aviation. I am, she said clearly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding rows. The founder and chief executive officer of Carter Ellington Aviation, the primary leasing entity for this aircraft and 32 others in Aerosky's current fleet. The effect was immediate. Michael Turner in 4C straightened fully, his eyes widening. Sophia Ramirez let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Even Jacob Miller's live stream stilled for a moment, his audience scrambling to confirm what they'd just heard. Brian's mouth opened, then closed. Heather blinked rapidly, her grip tightening on the phone in her hand. This very aircraft, Naomi continued, tail number N867CE, is under a long-term lease to Aerosky Airlines through my company. I signed that contract myself. The murmurs were no longer skeptical. They were incredulous. The idea that the woman they'd just seen accused of fraud owned the legal rights to the seat she occupied, and the aircraft itself, was a whiplash no one had prepared for. Reed gave a short nod. That is correct. I've confirmed her identity through corporate channels. For a moment, the atmosphere seemed to tip toward resolution, toward vindication. But Naomi wasn't finished. And, she said, her gaze sweeping the cabin, in addition to my role at Carter Ellington Aviation, I am also the managing partner at Summit Capital Investments. A few heads tilted, the significance not immediately sinking in. Naomi allowed the pause to stretch before delivering the next blow. Through Summit Capital, I hold a substantial equity position in United Continental Holdings, the parent company of Aerosky Airlines. The shock landed harder than the first reveal. This wasn't just about leasing contracts or a single airline relationship. This was ownership, direct influence over the very corporate entity that employed Reed, Brian, Heather, and every crew member on the plane. Heather's practiced smile faltered entirely. Brian's fingers tightened around his tablet until the plastic creaked. Several passengers looked at Naomi with a new expression, part awe, part discomfort, as if they were only now realizing the full imbalance of power at play. Margaret Hill in 1D, who had earlier repeated her "I've seen this before" mantra, was now staring at her hands in her lap, cheeks flushed. "I may have been wrong," she muttered to no one in particular. Michael glanced toward Naomi. "Dr. Ellington, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying enough for nearby Rose to hear. "I should have spoken up sooner." Naomi gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but didn't linger on the sentiment. She knew the moment was still volatile. The revelation had swung the pendulum in her favor, but she could feel the room's energy, a mix of admiration, unease, and the dawning realization that this incident had just become a corporate earthquake. Jacob's live stream chat exploded with activity. "OMG, she owns the plane! Wait, she owns the airline? This is next-level power move." Others speculated on what would happen to Heather and Brian, their words a mixture of glee and thirst for justice. Heather, regaining some composure, tried to salvage her footing. "Dr. Ellington, regardless of your position, we have procedures to follow for—" Naomi's eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Procedures were bypassed the moment you chose to publicly accuse me without verification, live-stream the incident without consent, and escalate a false narrative to your internal PR channels." Heather's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Brian shifted his weight uncomfortably. Captain Reed cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, this matter is no longer about a seating dispute. It is a contractual and reputational issue for the airline at the highest level. Dr. Ellington, you have my full cooperation moving forward." Around them, the cabin's energy had transformed. Where there had been suspicion and whispers, there was now a palpable mix of embarrassment and respect. A woman in 2C leaned forward to murmur an apology. Even a man in 5A, who had earlier called out, "What's the holdup?" nodded toward Naomi in acknowledgement. Naomi gathered the black card and her boarding pass, placing them neatly back into her wallet. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "Now, let's address the matter of resolution, properly and transparently." Captain Reed stood in the center of the aisle, his posture squared as if addressing a briefing room, not a plane full of paying passengers. "Given the severity of what's transpired," he began, "I am taking immediate action." His voice was crisp, but there was a gravity to it that silenced the cabin. "Heather Collins," Reed continued, turning to the flight attendant whose smirk had long since vanished. "Your actions today, including public accusations without verification and unauthorized live streaming, constitute gross misconduct. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft upon arrival back at the gate." The words hit like a verdict. Gasps rose from nearby rows, and the faint whir of Jacob Miller's phone camera repositioning cut through the stillness. Heather's eyes widened, her voice catching on a protest that never fully formed. "I was—" she began, but Reed cut her off. "You were warned by training, policy, and common sense. There is no defense for what you've done here." Heather's jaw tightened. She glanced at Brian Hughes as if expecting backup, but the manager's own fate was sealed moments later. "Brian Hughes," Reed said, "you are suspended from duty pending formal investigation for procedural violations, including bypassing standard verification channels and escalating a passenger removal without captain's authorization." Brian's expression was carefully neutral, but the faint flush creeping up his neck betrayed him. "Captain, You acted against the company's own operational manual," Reed interrupted, "and in doing so, jeopardized both the safety and the integrity of this flight." The security officer standing by the bulkhead stepped forward. His instructions were clear: keep them in place until the aircraft returned to the gate for removal. The passengers watched in a kind of stunned fascination. witnessing an inversion of authority as those in charge became the accused. Reed then turned to face the rest of the cabin. On behalf of Aerosky Airlines, I apologize to Dr. Ellington for the entirely unacceptable treatment she has received. This should never have happened, and it will be addressed at the highest levels of our company. The apology, delivered publicly and without condition, sent a ripple through the rows. Michael Turner nodded to himself. Sofia Ramirez exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for the past half hour. Even Margaret Hill murmured an audible, "Good," though she kept her gaze on her folded hands. Naomi met Reed's eyes. "Thank you, Captain," she said evenly. "But there's more to address than just what happened in this cabin." She didn't elaborate. Not yet. The power of her restraint was that it invited speculation, letting her words travel further than volume ever could. For a brief moment, the atmosphere felt almost cathartic. Heather and Brian stood on the other side of judgment now, the crowd's sympathy beginning to tilt toward Naomi. The sense of justice, swift and public, hung in the air. But it didn't last. Heather's phone, still in her hand, buzzed with a discreet notification. She lowered her eyes to the screen, and a flash of something, relief, maybe satisfaction, passed over her face. Moments later, Brian's tablet chimed as well. He glanced down, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Somewhere beyond the fuselage, in Aerosky's downtown PR hub, the counteroffensive had begun. A carefully worded, internal leak was making its way through friendly media channels. An email chain, stripped of identifying metadata, allegedly showing Naomi leveraging her economic position to threaten the airline during the incident. The phrasing was surgical, never outright accusing her of blackmail, but suggesting she'd implied financial retaliation if she didn't get her way. It was enough to reframe her as a powerful figure bullying regular employees. The optics calculated to bleed sympathy from those who didn't know the full story. Within minutes, Jacob's live stream viewers were sending links to the leak into his chat. Comments began to fracture. "She's just flexing her money. Figures. Rich people always pull this stunt." Still racial profiling, though. The moral clarity of the moment blurred under the weight of competing narratives. Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with a secure ping from her communications director. She glanced at the preview. Leak in circulation, controlled narrative push, advise response. She locked the screen without typing a reply. Then, turning slightly in her seat so the nearest rows could hear, she spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I'm aware of what's being circulated," she said. "And I want to be clear, this isn't about money. It never was." She paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not seeking financial compensation from Aerosky Airlines. I want systemic change. This is about making sure no one else, whether they can afford to fight back or not, has to endure what happened here today." Her voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who knew her audience extended far beyond the confines of the cabin. Michael felt his shoulders loosen. Sophia sat taller in her seat. Even Jacob, sensing the weight of her words, stopped narrating for a moment and simply filmed. Heather's lips thinned. The PR counterattack wasn't supposed to be met with calm repudiation. It was supposed to draw Naomi into a defensive posture, to make her look combative. Naomi continued, her gaze steady on no one and everyone at once. "What happened here isn't a personal inconvenience. It's a breach of trust between a company and the people it serves. You don't fix that with a settlement check. You fix it with accountability and reform." The line landed hard. Passengers exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism eroded by the dignity with which she framed the issue. Captain Reed nodded slowly. "Then let's start with accountability now," he said, glancing toward the security officer to ensure his earlier orders were still in place for Heather and Brian. The rest of the flight crew, watching from the galley and the aisle, seemed to shift subtly, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer, as if the fog of procedural compliance had finally lifted. Naomi picked up her phone, this time dialing deliberately. The screen glowed with a secure connection, the kind not available to the public. She didn't raise her voice, but the words were unmistakable to those closest. "Yes, this is Dr. Ellington. Begin drafting the reform proposals. We'll need them ready within 48 hours. She ended the call and placed the phone back down, her expression unchanged. For her, the counterpunch from PR was just another move on a board she'd been playing her entire career. The difference was, this time, she had the public watching each piece she advanced. In row 3B, Sophia whispered to Michael, "They're trying to spin it, but it's not working." Michael nodded. "Not against her. She's too prepared." Heather stared at the carpet, the initial flush of indignation replaced by something closer to dread. Brian adjusted his grip on the tablet, but his earlier smirk was gone. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. "Let them talk," she murmured, just loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. "I didn't come here to win an argument. I came here to change the rule." For a few tense minutes, the balance of power in the cabin had tilted sharply toward Naomi Ellington. Heather and Brian were sidelined under security watch. Reed had issued a public apology, and several passengers had begun openly aligning themselves with Naomi's account of events. But Naomi knew better than to mistake momentum for victory. Airlines were complex machines, part steel and jet fuel, part bureaucracy and politics. And in her years navigating the upper tiers of corporate aviation, she'd learned that bureaucratic gears could grind justice into dust if left unchecked. She reached for her phone, unlocking it with a slow, deliberate swipe. The screen lit up with an encrypted dialer, the kind reserved for secure government and corporate channels. Her thumb hesitated for a fraction of a second before pressing a contact labeled simply Chair, Senate Transportation. The call connected in less than 2 rings. Naomi kept her voice low, but those in the nearest rows could see her posture shift into something sharper, more official. "Yes," she said. "It's me. I'm on Aerosky Flight 417. We have an active discriminatory incident in progress. I need you to initiate oversight protocols. No, I don't want a media leak yet. Just have the committee council on standby." She ended the call, set the phone on the tray table, and returned her gaze to the window. It was as if she had just loaded a new piece on the chessboard, one invisible to most of the cabin but potentially game-ending to those who understood the rules. A moment later, she reopened the lease agreement on her tablet. This time, she navigated past the payment schedules and aircraft specs to a section highlighted in crimson, Section 47, Anti-Discrimination and Hostile Environment Provisions. She expanded the clause, letting the text fill the screen. Any lessee found to engage in discriminatory practices against protected classes while operating leased aircraft may face immediate contract review and potential termination. It was the nuclear option, baked into the DNA of the contract. If invoked, it could trigger a full review of Aerosky's leasing rights for not only this aircraft, but every plane supplied by Carter Ellington Aviation. She rotated the screen toward Captain Reed, who had returned from the cockpit. "This is the clause you should be most concerned with," she said. "It's enforceable immediately, without the need for arbitration." Reed's eyes scanned the language, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I understand the weight of this, Dr. Ellington, but company legal will want to confirm its applicability before he could finish. His interphone buzzed. He stepped a few feet away, listening intently. When he returned, his expression had tightened. "Corporate counsel is aware of your claim," he said. "They're citing an emergency operations exception that could delay any lease review until the completion of this flight." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "The emergency exception is for mechanical, weather, or safety of flight issues, not for shielding discriminatory conduct from contractual consequences." Reed didn't disagree, but his voice carried the fatigue of someone caught between operational command and corporate directives. "They'll argue it applies here under crew operational necessity. It's a stalling tactic." The words rippled through her mind, familiar and infuriating. She had seen this play before. When cornered, corporations sought refuge in the gray fog of policy, hoping to run out the clock on accountability. From 2 rows back, Sophia watched the exchange with rising tension. She could see the exact moment Naomi understood she was no longer just fighting Heather or Brian. She was up against Aerosky's legal engine. Michael Turner leaned slightly forward. "They're trying to wait you out," he murmured toward Naomi. She didn't turn around, but her voice carried. "I know." Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her general counsel. "We can serve notice of review in flight, but they'll claim non-binding until landing. Recommend escalating to Oversight Committee for immediate jurisdiction." Naomi typed back a single word. "Proceed." Heather, overhearing just enough to sense trouble, shifted in her seat under the watch of the security officer. Brian glanced toward the cockpit, perhaps wondering if Corporate's legal shield would extend to him personally. Naomi tapped the screen of her tablet once more, pulling up a series of correspondence logs between Carter Ellington Aviation and Aerosky's executive team. "Every one of these communications," she said to Reed, "includes a reminder of Section 47's scope. They've acknowledged it in writing." Reed nodded, but his voice remained careful. "I'm not disputing your standing, but until the company's lawyers step aside, my role is limited." "Then perhaps," Naomi replied evenly, "you should consider whether following their stall puts you in breach of your own command authority." The captain met her gaze for a moment longer before glancing away. The cabin had grown quieter, the earlier chatter replaced by the hum of a collective realization. This wasn't just a customer service dispute anymore. It was a battle of contracts, policy, and raw corporate leverage. And while Naomi held a weapon powerful enough to upend the airline's operations, the company's legal department had just erected a wall around itself. In 1C, Jacob's viewers were beginning to piece it together. "She's got them cornered, but they're lawyering up," one comment read. "They're trying to drag it out until she can't do anything mid-flight." Another countered, "She's too smart for that. Watch." Naomi closed the tablet, folding her hands over it. "They can stall all they want," she said softly. "But the review clock starts now, and when we land, they won't have an inch of procedural ground left to stand on." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to reach both her allies and her opponents in the cabin. The wall of corporate policy might slow her advance, but it would not stop it. Not when she had already set the rest of the system in motion. The tension in the cabin had settled into a brittle equilibrium. Naomi holding the moral and contractual high ground, Aerosky's legal team throwing up procedural smokescreens. Most passengers assumed they'd seen the last big reveal, but Naomi Ellington wasn't done. She unlocked her phone and opened a secure app that none of the passengers recognized. Its interface was stark. White text on a dark background, no branding. She turned the screen toward Captain Reed. Since corporate has chosen to hide behind emergency exceptions, perhaps they'd like to be reminded of the nature of this flight. Reed's brow furrowed. "The nature of the flight? This isn't just Flight 417 to Atlanta," Naomi said. "It's an audit, incognito." A low ripple passed through the surrounding rows. Even Brian Hughes, still under security escort, looked over. Naomi tapped the screen, bringing up a document bearing the seals of both Carter Ellington Aviation and the United States Senate Committee on Transportation. The title was impossible to misinterpret. Pilot Program, Cultural Service Compliance Audit. "I am flying," Naomi continued, "under a covert operational review jointly developed between my company and the Senate Transportation Committee. We've been testing compliance procedures, bias recognition, and crisis management in live service environments. Every incident, every crew interaction, every procedural choice has been recorded in real time." The cabin went very still. Sofia Ramirez's eyes widened. She understood instantly what that meant. The entire chain of events, Heather's live stream, Brian's procedural sabotage, the corporate PR leak, wasn't just anecdotal anymore. It was hard data, already time-stamped and preserved beyond the airline's control. Michael Turner leaned forward. "So, this was all part of a test?" Naomi shook her head. "The test was the opportunity. What you've all witnessed was Aerosky's real culture under stress. And now it's a case study, one that will be reviewed by federal oversight, industry boards, and the top executives of every carrier in our leasing network." Captain Reed's face was unreadable, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He'd just realized the incident had transcended company politics. It was going to land, literally and figuratively, on desks far above his pay grade. Naomi swiped to a new screen, a live dashboard showing streaming metrics. In one panel, a real-time capture of Jacob Miller's live stream audience count. In another, metadata logs tracking the exact moments Heather initiated her live stream. Brian placed the manual hold on the ticket, and security was called. "These logs," Naomi said, "are cross-referenced with cockpit communications, cabin service records, and passenger witness accounts. Every decision made here is already part of an immutable audit trail." Brian's complexion drained. Heather's lips parted, a flicker of panic showing before she caught herself. She must have known then that no amount of PR spin could erase actions already stamped into a government-audited dataset. Jacob's chat feed exploded. "Oh my God, it's a sting-op. This is bigger than just her seat. Every airline exec in the country is about to have a heart attack." Aviation forums began clipping the reveal in real time. Hashtags shifted from #AeroskyBias to #AuditFlight and #ServiceCultureFail. Naomi wasn't finished. "Our program's objective," she said, "is to identify not just overt misconduct, but the structural weaknesses that enable it. Lack of procedural verification, bias in decision-making, and inadequate crisis response. This flight has provided a textbook example." Sophia found her voice. "And the Senate? They'll see all of this?" Naomi nodded once. "And the FAA, and the Civil Rights Division at the DOJ, and every major shareholder in United Continental Holdings." For the first time, the murmurs in the cabin weren't about gossip or speculation. They were about scale. Passengers began to understand they were sitting inside an event that would ripple across the entire industry. Captain Reed cleared his throat. "Dr. Ellington, I'll see to it that you have full access to any additional flight data you require." "You won't need to," Naomi replied evenly. "The data's already been captured and transmitted." That landed like a hammer. Whatever Aerosky's corporate office had hoped to contain was already beyond containment. From the corner of the cabin, Heather muttered, "You set us up." Naomi turned her head slightly. "I gave you an opportunity to show who you are under pressure. You made the choices. I simply ensured the world would see them clearly." Michael let out a quiet, "Damn," under his breath. Sophia sat back, almost in disbelief at the composure Naomi maintained. Within minutes, industry insiders began joining Jacob's live stream. Pilots, union reps, even a few investment analysts. Comments shifted from outrage to analysis, dissecting every procedural failure in the timeline. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby. "By the time we land, the narrative will have shifted. This won't be about me. It will be about Aerosky's fitness to operate under its own contracts." And she was right. The public conversation was already pivoting. The scammer smear was dying under the weight of official-looking documents and live data feeds. Investors were taking note. Union leaders were screenshotting metrics. The PR counteroffensive had been swallowed by the larger revelation. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation in C2A was now something else entirely, a systemic reckoning in progress. The reveal had shifted the air in the cabin into something electric but controlled, like a storm system balanced on the edge of breaking. The crew, the passengers, and the 2 disgraced employees under security escort all understood now. Naomi Ellington was no longer simply defending herself. She was setting the terms for what came next. Captain Reed stood in the aisle, headset in hand, waiting for the go-ahead from corporate. But Naomi didn't wait for their blessing. She was already drafting a framework on her tablet, the same way she might at a boardroom table. "This is not going to end with an apology," she said, her voice clear enough to carry without raising it. "If Aerosky is to maintain our partnership and avoid a permanent lease review, we're going to institutionalize change, real change, measurable change." From her bag, she pulled a slim leather portfolio and slid a single sheet onto the tray table. 5 numbered bullet points ran down the page, each one precise, each one with teeth. "First," she began, "bias recognition training with mandatory certification. She looked directly at Captain Reed. Every customer-facing employee, crew, gate agents, security, will undergo standardized unconscious bias training, and it won't be a check-the-box exercise. There will be a written exam and a scenario-based evaluation. Pass-fail, annual recertification. If you fail, you're removed from duty until you pass. A murmur rippled through the passengers. Someone in 4C muttered, "About time." Second, a two-tier verification protocol, Naomi continued. Any challenge to a passenger's documentation must be verified by two independent systems with a digital signature from a supervisor before any removal or downgrade is authorized. Sophia's eyes lit up. "That would have stopped this before it started," she whispered to Michael. Third, Naomi said, a 24/7 independent passenger hotline outside the airline's own customer service chain. Her tone sharpened. Incidents like this don't get buried in hold music. They get logged, time-stamped, and routed directly to an oversight body with authority to intervene in real time. Heather shifted uncomfortably. Brian stared at the floor. Fourth, public-facing dashboards, Naomi went on. Quarterly reports on discrimination complaints, resolution times, and training compliance rates. No spin, no buried PDFs. Every investor, regulator, and passenger will see the numbers. A few passengers nodded, the impact dawning on them. Fifth and final, the stop-the-clock authority, she said. The captain will have explicit override power to halt any passenger removal when there's a credible concern about bias or procedural error, without needing to fear retaliation from corporate. Captain Reed straightened slightly. That, he said, would change a lot of decisions in the field. Naomi tapped the paper. These aren't suggestions, they're the terms. Then she leaned back, delivering the twist with surgical timing. And because we're not here just to punish, here's the carrot. Summit Capital is prepared to increase its investment in Aerosky's parent company by 15% on the condition that these reforms are implemented and the key performance indicators are met for 2 consecutive quarters. That landed like a second thunderclap. The passengers could almost see the stock charts spiking in the minds of executives listening in through Reed's headset. Naomi didn't let them breathe too easily. And the stick. If those KPIs are missed, Summit will activate clawback provisions on its current holdings and initiate a board-level review of executive performance. Jacob Miller's live stream chat went wild. She's literally giving them millions if they behave, and nuking them if they don't. From the cockpit, Reed relayed the framework to corporate in clipped, precise tones. When he finished, his earpiece crackled for a long minute. He listened, nodded once, then turned back to Naomi. They're asking for clarification on the KPI structure, he said. Quarterly bias complaint rate reduced by 50% from baseline, Naomi answered without looking at her notes. Resolution times under 48 hours for 90% of cases, 100% compliance on annual training, and full publication of all metrics, no exceptions. Reed repeated the numbers. There was a pause, then he gave a small, incredulous smile. They've agreed to terms provisionally. They want formal documentation within 48 hours. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. They'll have it in 24. Heather finally spoke, her voice small but bitter. So you win. You get your reforms, and the rest of us just get thrown under the bus. Naomi turned to her. Heather, you didn't get thrown anywhere. You stepped, and every step you took was recorded. This isn't just about you. It's about fixing a system so that no one else repeats your mistakes. The words landed heavy in the silent cabin. Sophia broke the tension. Dr. Ellington, this could change the industry. It will, Naomi said simply, if they keep their end of the bargain. On Jacob's stream, aviation investors began chiming in. One posted, if they hit those KPIs, I'll double my position. Another, this could actually make Aerosky a leader in ESG compliance. Naomi allowed herself the smallest smile. She knew the metrics weren't just about social good. They were about long-term profitability. The two could, in the right hands, be the same thing. Reed cleared his throat. Dr. Ellington, corporate also requests If you're willing, a joint press statement when we land. To announce the reforms. She considered, then nodded. On one condition, it goes out unedited, word for word as I write it, and it acknowledges the discriminatory nature of the incident. No euphemisms. I'll relay that, Reed said. By now, the passengers weren't just spectators. They were witnesses to an agreement that felt historic. Michael whispered to Sophia, "We came in here thinking we'd just get to Atlanta. Now we're in the middle of an aviation reform summit at 30,000 feet. Naomi gathered her papers, slid them back into the leather portfolio, and looked out the window. Below, the clouds drifted in soft layers, the same as they always did. But above those clouds, she had just redrawn the rules of the game. 6 months had passed since Flight 417. The memory of that winter morning still lived in the minds of those who had been there, but the industry around them had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The quarterly reports told the first part of the story. Bias-related passenger complaints across Aerosky Airlines had dropped by more than 70%. Resolution times for incidents averaged under 24 hours, and the new 2-tier verification protocol was preventing conflicts before they could take root. Investors noticed. Regulators noticed. Competitors noticed. But the deeper change wasn't in the numbers. It was in the culture. Every new hire, from pilots to gate agents, now sat through a mandatory day-long training module officially titled the Washington-Ellington Protocol. It was based on the case study of that single flight, complete with live footage, decision logs, and annotated timelines. The final segment of the training featured Captain Reed's own voice. If you feel a decision is driven by bias rather than fact, stop the clock. The captain's authority is there to protect safety and dignity. In a bright conference room at Aerosky's training center in Dallas, Michael Turner stood at the front, guiding a group of new recruits through the witness perspective section of the course. He'd been there in seat 4C, torn between speaking up and staying silent. Now, he shared that conflict openly. "You will be the bystander more often than the hero," he told them. "But you can still be the one who tips the scales toward what's right. That's what I wish I'd done sooner." Across the industry, other airlines adopted similar protocols. The FAA even circulated a draft regulation modeled after Aerosky's reforms, recommending them as a baseline for all carriers. Sofia Ramirez had taken a different path. She'd left Aerosky to found her own consulting firm, Equiflight Solutions, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies for aviation companies. Her first clients were 3 Latin American airlines, drawn by the viral reach of her Spanish-language live stream from that day. She employed a team of cultural competency trainers and policy analysts, and in her office hung a still frame from the moment Naomi Ellington revealed her second business card. "Everything changed for me in that second," she told a reporter during an interview. "It wasn't about power, it was about using power to fix what's broken." Even Margaret Thompson, the elderly woman who had once muttered support for Heather's hostility, found her own way to contribute. She joined Aerosky's Passenger Advisory Board, helping to draft traveler-facing policies and bringing the perspective of customers who weren't digital natives. At 67, she'd become an unlikely advocate for reform. "I learned that the hardest thing isn't speaking up for yourself. It's speaking up for someone you misjudged," she said in a press briefing. The changes were real. They were visible, and they were measurable. Then came the twist, the one Naomi hadn't told anyone about until it happened. In the newest iteration of the Washington-Ellington Protocol training video, there was a scene filmed just a month earlier. Heather Collins, the former flight attendant whose live stream had sparked the crisis, sitting in a neutral-toned interview room. Her posture was open, her voice steady. "I thought I was doing my job," she said, looking directly into the camera. "But I was doing my assumptions, and those are not the same thing. Dr. Ellington could have ended my career forever. Instead, she gave me a reason to change. I'm here to make sure none of you have to be the villain in someone else's story." The video cut to Heather assisting in a role-play exercise with new hires, demonstrating how to de-escalate a misunderstanding before it spiraled. It wasn't scripted redemption. It was lived accountability. When that clip first played in the training center, Michael noticed something remarkable. No one snickered, no one rolled their eyes. The room was silent, attentive. Heather's presence was a reminder that mistakes could be transformed into lessons, but only if the people who made them were willing to learn. And then, one spring afternoon in Washington, Naomi Ellington stepped onto a modest stage at a joint press event between Carter Ellington Aviation and the U.S. Senate Transportation Committee. She wore a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back, and she carried no notes. "I've been called a CEO, an investor, an auditor, even a disruptor," she began. "But today, I'm here as a traveler, someone who believes that every journey should begin with dignity and end with respect." Behind her, a screen displayed the logo of the Dignity in Transit Foundation. Naomi explained its mission: to provide legal aid and advocacy for travelers facing discrimination, to fund research into bias prevention in transportation, and to create scholarships for underrepresented communities seeking careers in aviation. The foundation had already secured partnerships with 3 major airlines, 2 train networks, and an international cruise line. It would be funded partly by Carter Ellington Aviation profits, partly by Summit Capital investments, and partly by a coalition of private donors, many of whom had been in the cabin on Flight 417. "This isn't charity," Naomi said. "It's infrastructure, because fairness shouldn't depend on the size of your wallet or the color of your skin. It should be built into the systems we all rely on." The applause started as soon as she stepped back from the podium, but true to her style, quiet power, the kind you never see coming, Naomi didn't linger to bask in it. She walked calmly off stage, leaving the audience still on their feet, clapping into the empty space she'd left behind. In the training center the following week, Michael paused the foundation announcement video at that exact moment. "That," he told the recruits, "is how you end a story without needing the applause. You let the work speak louder than the words." Some of the trainees smiled. Some just nodded, absorbing it. Out on a tarmac in Atlanta, a freshly painted Aerosky Airbus taxied into position. On the nose, just below the cockpit windows, a new emblem had been added: Protocol 417. For those who knew the story, it was a promise. For those who didn't, it was an invitation to ask. Naomi, standing by the hangar doors, watched it lift off into the pale blue sky. She didn't wave, didn't pose for photos. The work wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about the standard she'd set, the one that would fly on long after she'd left the frame.